achiever, spent my time mostly looking out the window or looking at the clock, trying to make it run faster. Um, and I was a not very good student at all. I grew up in New Jersey, 1960s, 70s, height of the Apollo space program. So space was something that, was something that I was interested in, but never um, actually thought it was possible. Um, my father was a police officer in New Jersey and came from a blue collar family. My mother was a secretary and a waitress. And about the time my brother and I were becoming teenagers, my mom decided that she wanted to become a cop at a time when there were no female police officers in the state. She had to do all the same tests, and including scaling this 7-foot 4-inch tall wall in our backyard that my father built in our backyard. And I can remember the first time she tried to get over that, she fell into the dirt. I thought she'd never get over it all. And just remember her saying, you know what? I'm going to just try to touch the top. As soon as I can touch the top, I'm going to see how long I can hold on. Once I can hold on, maybe I can do a pull-up, maybe quite possibly the end of the summer, I'll be able to go get over this wall. And she went to took that test to become a police officer. She got over that wall in half the time she was supposed to, did better than a lot of the men did on this physical fitness test, and became the first female police officer, one of the first in the state of New Jersey, very first in my hometown. And this is the first time in my life that I had saw the power of having this goal you think you might not be able to achieve, a plan to get there, and then working really, really hard at something that you really wanted. Now, unfortunately, this did not help or inspire me to become a better student. I think if I was a kid today, I'd probably be, diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. And so school wasn't my thing. I did graduate from high school in the bottom half of my high school class. Not proud of that. But I went to college like everyone else. I actually went to the wrong school. I know some of you guys might be contemplating college. It's important not to go to the wrong school. But I went to the wrong school in that I actually applied and showed up to one college thinking I was going to go to this other one over here. Quite possibly the only person to ever really, truly go to the wrong college. And I get there and I'm like, hey, when's the football game? The kids are like, football game? We don't even have a football team at this school. And then I basically was doing the same thing I did in high school. I couldn't pay attention. I'm eventually not even going to class anymore. Really one of those, fast track freshmen to, college dropout. And one day I'm walking across the college campus, and I'm going to stand up for a second and disappear for a second. But I happened to walk into the college bookstore to buy. You can see I was actually wearing pants. That was just a joke, I think. But I went into the college bookstore to buy gum or something, not a book. I was not a big reader. But I saw this book on the shelf, and it had this really cool cover and a red, white, and blue title. And I picked it up, and I looked at the back, what it was about. And I read it, and I felt like I could relate to the people in this book. It's The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. Felt like I could relate to them. These guys, they were all guys at the time, not anymore, but the guys that became the original Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo astronauts. And I felt like I had things in common with them, but with one exception. And I was not a good student, and I didn't know how to study or pay attention. But I thought if I could just fix that one thing about myself, maybe, quite possibly, I could, fly airplanes in the Navy. And if not the Navy, maybe the Air Force, and become a test pilot. Maybe even quite possibly an astronaut. I know you might think, young kid reads book, decides he or she's going to become an astronaut. That's a giant leap. Really, in retrospect, what it was a bunch of much smaller, manageable steps, one built upon the other. So I changed schools, I changed majors, figured out how to study, started doing well. And then 5 years after picking this book up, basically, graduated from college with a commission in the U.S. Navy and a engineering degree, and I head down to Pensacola, Florida, get there to learn how to fly airplanes. The first thing I realize when I get there is I am not a particularly good pilot. Never flown an airplane before. No, it's hard to believe for a guy that has landed the space shuttle, but I was not particularly good at it at first. But I worked really, really hard and knew how to study and pay attention now. And I focused on it. And eventually I got my Navy wings and went on to fly fighter planes. The F-14 Tomcat, which some of you might be aware of, was being in a movie in the 1980s, new one coming out, but it was an airplane from the movie Top Gun. And the first time I went to land that plane on the aircraft carrier, we do this during the daytime at first, then at night. Night's harder. And I almost crashed. I landed so low that the resting hook of the airplane actually hit the back of the ship. And but I stopped, caught the first wire, stopped, raised the hook, went, taxied to the catapult, and I thought they were sending me to the catapult again, but I get taxied to the side, and they chain the airplane down. I jump out, and the instructor says to me, "Are you sure this career is for you? I mean, you almost crashed, and we're not going to let you do this again." So I had failed and disqualified. They sent me home. And over the course of the next few weeks, the instructors or the commanding officer of the squadron talked to me, and he said, "You know, you really scared us. We not sure if we're going to let you do this again, but if we're going to give you another option." The other option was to fly like a heavy airplane, like an airliner. And I didn't know if I could do that either. I'd never flown a big airplane before, but they said, "You know, if you want to try again, understand you're not going to just have to pass. You're going to have to do really well. We're going to have to be confident in you. And if you don't qualify in the F-14, you're probably not going to fly any airplanes at all in the Navy. This is your last chance." And I thought to myself, you know, if I'm going to fail at something, I might as fail at something that is really, really hard rather than something that's easier. At least this way, I'll know, you know, exactly what I'm capable of doing. And I think people that are very successful in life, a lot of them, are risk takers. They know that, you know, sometimes we need to make mistakes and fail. And it's a very important trait. Now, hopefully that failure doesn't wind up getting you killed, like almost in my case. But taking risks, being able to be willing to fail is something that has always, I think, helped me achieve some pretty significant accomplishments in my life. So I went back to the ship. I became a fighter pilot. I wasn't the best fighter pilot in the beginning, but in the end, you know, I got pretty good enough to become a test pilot. Later, I basically applied to become an astronaut almost as a, you know, just because everyone else was doing it. Never actually believed I could be an astronaut and fly in space, but you know, that was kind of the attitude I had, and was lucky enough to get an interview to after I applied. Did well enough, I think, in the interview, or maybe there was some luck involved. I don't know. You know, like what I like to say about luck is when timing meets or opportunity meets preparation is luck. And I'm not sure if you guys can hear this, but I do have some construction going on in my new house occasionally. The guy in the basement with a drill. So hopefully you can't hear that. But anyway, I became an astronaut, and in 1999, I flew my first flight in space. Almost 18 years to the day when I read Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, at 18 years old. And I head out to the launch pad with my fellow crewmates, get into the space shuttle, and wish I had some slides here I could show you, but I haven't quite mastered this whole Zoom thing yet. But I need to figure this out. But we get into the space shuttle about 3.5 hours prior to the launch. Clock's counting down towards zero. This was a mission. My first flight was a mission to repair the Hubble Space Telescope, 1999, before you guys were born, right? Emergency repair mission, and clock's counting down towards zero. During the whole 3 hours, you're getting all of these 2,000 switches and circuit breakers that are inside the space shuttle, getting them configured in the right way. Um, at 9 minutes, the countdown clock stops. That's to give you time to catch up if you happen to be behind on what you're doing. It's also the point you think, man, this is a stupid thing to be doing, flying into space. I mean, especially if you've never done it before, pretty a little scary. But you can't get away. You're strapped in tight. Your hatch is bolted closed. Plus, it would look really silly to be the first astronaut to run away from the rocket. Clock picks up at 9 minutes, gets to 6 seconds. The main engine's light, 3 giant main engines, 1,000,000 pounds of thrust, they light. But you don't go anywhere because you're bolted to the launch pad by these 8 giant bolts. And the clock goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 at 0. Bolts are exploded open, solid rocket motors light. And it feels like the hand of God has just lifted you off the launch pad and is throwing you into outer space. And I know some of you have seen a rocket lift off before, maybe the shuttle on TV. It looks like it lifts off slowly. When you're inside, there's nothing slow about this. You get the feeling you're going somewhere. You're not sure where you're going, but you know you're not coming back to Florida. People often ask me when I launched on the space shuttle, especially since you have all these windows, hey, what does it look like when you punch a hole in the sky? Like, I don't know. Never looked out the window one time. And you might wonder why. Well, in the Navy, we were taught this idea, and in NASA as well, this idea of compartmentalization, focusing on the things you have control over and ignoring what you have no control over. So what I had control over was my job, my 2,000 switches and circuit breakers, and looking outside, the fact that I was on the rocket was not one of them. So I never even thought to look out the window. And I think, in today's environment, right, the things that are going on right now between the pandemic, civil unrest, there is stuff that we can control ourselves, our education, our future, maybe a little bit. I mean, we can plan for it, but then there are things we have no control over. Like, we have no control over when this pandemic is going to be over, but what we can do is be contributors to the solution and not the problem. It wasn't until I got into space and I was there for 20 minutes that saw something on the horizon. I didn't even recognize what it was. And I glanced outside and I said, what is that? And the commander of the space shuttle said, that's the sunrise. And I was just absolutely floored. First time seeing the Earth from space. As the sun rose, it was like I just saw the most beautiful thing I will ever see in my entire life. And I knew right then and there, never see that again. We had to get to work. We had to fix the Hubble, did 3 spacewalks. I didn't do it. My crewmates did, repaired it, and then sent it back to the universe to do its incredible work. I came back. That was right before Y2K also. They made us come back early before Y2K. You might not be familiar much with Y2K either. It's when your parents and everyone else got really upset about 0 and the fact that computers were going to divide by 0, and we didn't know what was going to happen. Turned out nothing happened. Life went on. Life will go on. After that flight, I flew a mission that was as the commander of the space shuttle to build the International Space Station. Then I flew a long duration space flight of nearly 6 months. And when I got back from that flight, NASA started talking about sending 2 people in space for a year, nearly a year. And that's really what I'm known for, is the guy who spent a year in space. And you might wonder why. Why do we want to spend a year in space, right? But because someday we want to go to Mars. And when we're in space, bad things happen to our physiology. When we're in space for long periods of time, we lose bone mass, 1% a month, muscle mass at an equivalent rate. There's effects on our immune system, our health, our vision, the effects of radiation, anywhere from 10 to 20 chest x-rays every single day. So that's why I spent nearly a year on the International Space Station. So in March of 2015, second time in my life, I'm in this place called Kazakhstan, Baikonur, Russian Space Agency launch site, Central Asia, middle of nowhere, which is a great place to be when you're launching into space for a year. You kind of feel like you're already halfway there. And me and my Russian colleagues, we get into the actually similar process to the space shuttle in that you're launching into space. That's kind of where the similarity stops, though, because you get up to the launch pad, and the launch pad isn't abandoned like it is in Florida of people. There's like 100 people at the base of this rocket. You're just trying to get through the crowd, and some of them are actually smoking cigarettes. Seriously, smokers at the base of a fully fueled rocket, liquid oxygen, liquid kerosene. So you want to get out of there as soon as you can. You might wonder why, smokers at the base of this rocket. Well, I really can't explain the smokers, but I can explain all the people. And that is, Russians who have been great partners with us in space have some traditions, some superstitions. And one of their big things is if their friends are going on a long trip, they have to be there to say goodbye. So we get in the rocket, get in the Soyuz, about as small as possibly can be, and you can fit 3 grown people in there. Clock is counting. Actually, there's no clock really. You have your watch, and after about 3 hours, you're like, "Hey, what time are we leaving?" Was that like 10:10 was that Moscow time or Baikonur time? Time passes, and eventually you just hear this guy come up on the radio, this Russian guy. All he says is ignition. And I can just picture one of those smokers lighting that rocket with a match. The Soyuz lifts off slowly, and small vehicle, tightly packed in there. But 6 hours later, we're docking to the International Space Station. I'm in the cupola right now, virtually, on the International Space Station. I get inside the space station, and the place looks the same, sounds the same, smells the same. Misha and I, we float through the hatch together. My Russian colleague that I'm going to be there for a year with. Get inside, and I'm like, man, this is a stupid thing to do. Spending a year in space. I mean, you can't leave if you want. There's no Uber. Can't call an Uber. Someday maybe there'll be Uber space, I would imagine. But you might wonder what the space station's like. It's really big, weighs 1 million pounds, giant solar arrays. Really great example of a renewable energy system. Been up there longer than you guys have been alive, actually. Space station's there for science, mostly, but it's also designed for having humans live and work in space for long periods of time, because NASA believes, I believe, a lot of people believe, that we are explorers, and part of exploration is just continuing to move forward. So that's why the space station is there, and it will be our foothold in space until we have another one on the moon, and then later on Mars. Space station is designed to do a lot of science. One of the science experiments that got a lot of attention was an experiment on my brother Mark and I. Because we're identical twins, we very genetically similar. So that a lot of the science was because of that. Actually, I had an opportunity to do 3 spacewalks on this mission, and I'll tell you, going outside there in a vacuum, that's one of the most serious things you'll ever do in your life. And really, one of these moments where you absolutely have to focus on the stuff that you can control, what is right in front of you, your tethers, your tools, your procedures, and ignoring the fact that no matter how beautiful the space station is when you look, or the Earth is when you're looking out the window, when you're outside, it is mind-blowingly breathtaking. So focus on the things you can control, ignore what you can't. After 6 months, kind of fast forwarding ahead here a lot because I want to get to your questions. I don't want to yap at you too long. But after 6 months in being in space, eventually it's time to come home, and we get back into the Soyuz. It's about as small as it possibly can be, and you can fit 3 grown people in there. You're elbow to elbow, knees are up to your chin. It's painful. You undock from the space station, get about 5 miles away, fire the deorbit engines for about 4 minutes, slow down by a few hundred miles an hour only, and the rest of that speed is taken out by friction with the atmosphere, similar to the space shuttle when it comes back. But the space shuttle lands on a runway. It's really big. Um, Still risky. I lost 3 of my astronaut classmates and 4 of my fellow colleagues on Columbia. So it's a risky, shuttle's risky, but the the Soyuz, much more medieval experience. I mean, you hit the atmosphere and you're in this 3,000 degree fireball. Window is right by the side of your head. Pieces of the heat shield are blowing by, burning off and flying by. Whole thing's kind of like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. But while you're on fire, as soon as you realize you're not going to die, most fun you've ever had in your entire life. I hated every minute of my year in space. I do it all over again for the last 20 minutes. You hit the ground, it's like a car crash. Russian rescue guys are there within a few minutes, open a hatch, fresh air rushes inside, and it smelled like the first time I'd ever breathed fresh air in my entire life. You pull us out of the cockpit, and within 24 hours, I'm home in Houston. See my family for the first time in a year. Slept in a bed. Took a shower, first time in a year. Now, all those things were great. But the best part about coming home after a year in space is just knowing that I had just done the hardest thing I will ever have to do in my entire life. And it was an incredible experience. Learned a lot on the space station. Learned about risk taking. I think it's important for us to take risks. Like I said, it's important in our lives to make mistakes. You know, I got that example from my mother about having a goal and a plan. You know, failure is part of success, focusing on the stuff that we can control. Also learned about teamwork. You know, teamwork is critical to anything we do. Leadership. You know, people sometimes ask me what kind of leader I am, and I think it depends on the situation. You know, sometimes I feel like, you know, my leadership style is more recognizing, hey, who's the expert here, and letting that person make the decision. Sometimes, you know, it's important to vote on things. Other times, you know, I would get people's opinion. I would then make the decisions. Of course, if there's a fire, depressurization on the space station, that's the time to be the authoritarian, to be the dictator, make a decision, decide, tell everyone else what to do. Learned a lot about diversity at NASA. I came from the US Navy, where it was not a very diverse organization. Mostly it was white guys like me flying airplanes back then, much different now. But it wasn't until I got to NASA that I recognized that when you have people that come from different places, different cultures, different educational backgrounds, different gender orientation, basically different whatever, just different people have different ideas and different solutions to problems. And that's what we do at NASA. When you dumb it down, it's really about identifying what the problem is and finding a solution. I also learned a lot about planet Earth. I mean, despite how beautiful it is, very fragile looking, our atmosphere is incredibly thin. Parts of it almost always covered in pollution. Rainforests been kind of decimated. I noticed that over the course of my 20 years flying in space. Really, really need to take care of our planet Earth. It's the only one we have for now. You know, people sometimes say, hey, can't we go to that Earth-like planet, the closest one? If we went as fast as we possibly could right now, it would take 80,000 years to get there. The people that arrived would be a different species than the ones that left. This is not an option. We need to take care of this planet. So, having said all this, quite modified version of some stuff I often talk about. What I'd like to do is just kind of have some Q&A with you guys, open it up for questions. And then at the very end of this, I'd like to have a little bit of time for a conclusion. So why don't I turn it back over to you, Anne, and we can get going on the Q&A.
Fantastic. So questions can go into the chat and I'm happy to read them, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask questions. I did want to let you know that our students in their 11th grade, most of them read The Right Stuff for a summer assignment. So they're very familiar with that book.
So Ann, are you going to ask me the questions or you just want me to read them?
I'll read them out loud, and we do have some
Okay.
students that are going to ask you. They're going to unmute themselves. Go ahead, Finn.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. My question revolves around the recent launch from Kennedy Space Center by SpaceX, which many people sort of hailed as the start of a new era where private companies become the leaders in like space exploration. So I was wondering what your opinion on the commercialization of space travel is in light of the fact that NASA doesn't receive as much funding from the government as it used to in past decades.
Well, there's a couple of things there, right? So NASA's budget is actually, if you exclude the Apollo program, NASA's been pretty well supported. It gets generally bipartisan support. And, you know, unfortunately, we're always asked to do more things than they give us money for. But NASA's budget right now is probably the best it's been since the Apollo days. So the difference is with what we now consider commercialization in space is not that you have a company building space hardware, because the space shuttle was built by Rockwell International. It wasn't built by NASA. The lunar module was built by Grumman. Boeing's built the space station. The difference between those previous programs and what we've done with SpaceX is NASA decided that maybe there's a way to do this more economical. Because when you get the US government involved, the US government is the largest bureaucracy ever made. And somehow we've gotten to the point where you can't have one person make a decision. You have to have 100 people make a decision, and it takes, 20 meetings to do that. So what we did was we said, okay, in the case of SpaceX and Boeing, here's a few $1 billion. Here's what we want. We want this amount of safety. We want these abilities. Go do it and give us the product. You manage it, not NASA. So really the commercialization of space and this government partnership is really all about letting a company like SpaceX kind of do their thing. And hopefully it'll be just as safe or more safe than what we've done previously. So far, so good. I mean, that SpaceX launch was incredible. As far as I know, they had not had any issues. They recovered the first stage of the rocket to potentially reuse it again. And I think that SpaceX and doing things this way, assuming that we continue with a good safety record, this mission is far from over, that hopefully, it's one step closer to more common access to space. And, in the early days of aviation, it was very, very expensive to fly. It was very risky. This is going to be very expensive and very risky. But, someday if we want to have a space transportation system like we have an airline or aviation system, this is a really good first step. I'm very excited about it.
We have a question in the chat. What's something cool about space that nobody knows?
If nobody knows it, then how would I know it? I don't know.
Maybe that only you know.
I wouldn't say there's something that only I know. Space kind of has a smell, but that's been talked about before. When in an area between like two spacecraft or the airlock, if you've been doing a spacewalk, when you come back from the spacewalk or a cargo vehicle or something just docked, it smells like burnt metal to me, or sparklers, like on the 4th of July kind of sparklers, is how space smells to me. So I think that's kind of cool.
Where did your motivation come from? How did you generate this on a day-to-day basis when you were confronted with one of the most daunting tasks anyone has faced?
Well, I've always found my motivation to be that I've been given a job to do. I've been trusted to perform it well. Often my jobs, until I left NASA, and the military were pretty, had a pretty high level of performance requirements and risk. So that's what motivated me to the satisfaction that you get from working hard at something that's really, really challenging, and then being proud of yourself when you've accomplished it. And I'm not suggesting by talking to you guys that you guys are all going to become astronauts or work for NASA or even be, engineers or scientists. But I will challenge you to pick a field that you are interested in, something that's important, and then work hard at it, and then be proud of yourself for your success. And that's something that you can find in many, many areas of your lives.
Let's see. When you're on the International Space Station with people from all over the world, like what language do you speak? How do you communicate with each other?
Well, the official language of the space station is English. That was agreed to a long time ago. On the Soyuz, the spacecraft that I flew to the space station twice, the Russian Soyuz, we speak Russian on the Soyuz. So I took Russian for like 17 years. And what I would say is probably the first 10 years are the hardest. Once you get past the first 10 years, it's a little easier. But there are people from 17 different countries. I've flown in space with people from Spain, from Italy, Japan, Canada, although he spoke English pretty well. A lot of Russians. And the Russians, generally, their English is better than our Russian for a few reasons. One, apparently, is it's an easier thing to do to go from Russian to English. Linguists have figured, what the hardest transitions are. English to Russian is harder. But it's also because half of those guys have taken English in high school. Other half people take German. Russians are exposed to English culturally. And I think the most important factor is that English is a very useful language if you're traveling around the world. Whereas Russian, I've used it rarely unless I'm in Russia. So the Russian cosmonauts are more motivated. But we speak on the space station, sometimes a little bit of both. Sometimes you even mix the languages together, Russian word and grammar, mixed in with English.
Can you feel speed on the space station? Like, do you feel yourself moving at such a high rate on the space station?
Well, the space station isn't accelerating. So generally the feeling of speed is, to me, due to acceleration. As a car gets up to speed, you feel that. Once it's going, you don't feel the acceleration anymore once you're at a stable speed. What you do see is the stuff, the road going by. So on the space station, there's no acceleration. So you don't feel that. Microgravity. You do see the Earth passing quickly below, but it's so far below you that it doesn't feel like you're on a motorcycle fast. But when you fly over the United States and it takes 15 minutes and you're traveling 5 miles a second, conceptually, you're going really, really fast. But you don't really feel it. You kind of see it. The fastest sensation of speed I think I've ever had in my life was I rode there's a 2-seat Indy car, a race car, and I rode in the back one time at 200 miles an hour. I also went 400 miles an hour in a truck once, but that was so fast I didn't even basically notice it.
Here's one from one of our seniors. I heard you grew 2 inches in space, and when you came down, you were taller than your twin. First of all, is that true? I don't know. And then if it is, why? How?
Well, I didn't grow. I stretched about 1.5 inches. Everyone does in space. Gravity, pushes everything down, and including our spine. And I would imagine, I always say this, and I always say I'm going to try to do this, but I never do. But I, if you measure yourself, maybe I'll do it tonight. If you measure yourself before you go to sleep, standing up, and then measure yourself before you get out of bed in the morning, I bet you're probably taller, maybe half inch, maybe even an inch taller, because your spine was able to expand. I don't know why that became such a big story. I'd probably answer that question more than anything else.
Have you seen, I imagine the answer to this is yes, but have you seen overlaps with your time in the space station and this quarantine? And do you have any tips for us to manage it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of parallels between living in isolation in space and living in isolation at home. Between understanding, that you're part of a team, who your team is in quarantine, what are their skills? Sometimes, I think it's everyone's responsibility to elevate each other, but sometimes you just got to realize, hey, that person or me, I'm not going to be as good at something that, we really want or like. And you have to kind of learn to manage your team within their own abilities. Um, Having a schedule was so important in space, and it's so important now to have a schedule where your weekdays are set a certain way. Um, like when I get up, my schedule is a little bit off now because we just moved from Houston to Colorado. But having a schedule in the morning with time for yourself, time for work or school, time for exercise or to get outside a little bit to get some light, time to connect with your friends and family, time to take care of the environment you're in. Um, the exercise and light are important for immune systems. Taking care of your environment. I kind of treat the front door of my apartment or now house as almost like an airlock on the space station. On the space station, virus and bacteria grow very, very quickly. And our immune systems are suppressed. So this is something that we need to consider. So, the schedule thing and having your weekends different than your weekdays. You definitely need something to break up the monotony. And actually NASA, when I was in space, structured my week schedule very closely. And I found that when I was in Houston until very recently, if you would have asked me how long I was in quarantine, I couldn't tell you. What I was looking at is, what am I doing tomorrow? What am I doing on the weekend? And knowing there's stuff that you can control, focusing on that and ignoring what you can't control. The other thing about this pandemic is, we are all in this together, where our actions will affect not only ourselves and our family, but others. And I think when we look back on this, and because it will be over someday, do we want to remember this experience as a positive one, that you handled it well and you were part of the solution versus part of the problem? I hope so. That's how I want to think about it. So yeah, absolutely, a lot of parallels between living in space and surprisingly this environment that we're currently living in.
Can you talk a little bit about what they studied with you and your twin brother in terms of the impacts of space?
Yeah, so most of the experiments were either genetic based or or they were cognitive, like critical thinking, memory, reaction time, things like that. How me being in space for a long time changed. The interesting stuff. Now, I'm not the scientist, so I'm not the expert on this, but some of the ones that interested me was an experiment on our telomeres. Telomeres are the ends of our chromosomes, and as we age, our telomeres they're like caps. They get shorter, more frayed, indication of our physical age compared to our calendar age. And the hypothesis was that my telomeres would get shorter compared to my brother Mark's. In fact, they got better, longer. which is interesting when you have an experiment and the hypothesis is the results are opposite the hypothesis. Now, initially, people thought that maybe that was due to the exercise we do, the diet, and my telomeres went basically right back to normal as soon as I got back. And then about a year after I was back and we were talking about some of this data, it turned out the Japanese had an experiment on the space station at the same time where they had these small worms, and it was a genetic experiment on their worms and these worms. And they looked at these worms and they saw that their telomeres improved in space too. And I never once saw those guys working out on the treadmill or riding the bike. So there's actually more to this than that. Probably not the fountain of youth, but definitely something that is very interesting. I think the big result is after being in space for a year, I got both smarter and more handsome than my brother Mark.
Let's see. Are you still in touch with people you were on the International Space Station with?
I am in touch with a lot of them, actually. I've been in space with 40 different people over the course of my 520 days in space. So some of them more so than others. Surprisingly, the people that I'm in touch the most with are 3 of the Russian cosmonauts and a Italian woman, more so than some of my American colleagues. Russians, they seem like they have this very hard outer surface, but once you break through that, you can become closer friends with them much more quickly. I did a video conference like this with Misha Kornienko, the guy I was in space with for a year, and Sergei Volkov, a guy we were there for 6 months with. It was fun. They were in Moscow and I was in Houston, chatting for about an hour.
Nice. This is an interesting question, I thought. Have you seen the movie Gravity, and would you say it is realistic?
I saw the movie Gravity on the space station, which is like watching a movie of your house burning down while you're inside of it. It's realistic in that the space station and the Soyuz look like looks very real. That was very, very realistic. One of the Italian woman I flew with, Samantha Cristoforetti, actually sort of resembles Sandra Bullock with her short hair. And there was a moment we're watching the movie, and she wasn't watching it. She was working out on her exercise, and she was exercising. In the scene where Sandra Bullock is kind of flying in the middle of the space station in her underwear, we had the big projector screen up in the hatchway of that same module. And Samantha Cristoforetti in her gym clothes just kind of floated behind it. And I rushed to grab a camera to take a picture, and then she was gone. It would have been the greatest photo. And then for some reason, I never tried to recreate it. But the things that are not realistic about that movie were all the physics of how stuff behaved. And then the personalities were not like real astronauts. We don't have like the George Clooney kind of like, I don't know, just careless kind of jerk guy, or the whiny, crying woman astronaut. We don't have either of those two people, but the space station and the Soyuz looked very, very real. And the Earth looked pretty good too.
So actually, Luke, do you want to ask this question? I see what you put in the chat.
Yeah, sorry. Basically, one thing that we're trying to set up is some sort of resilience award, and I thought it'd be interesting to get kind of your thoughts on kind of what that word means. So I basically had said, you must have been incredibly resilient to, be in space for that long, especially with people from other cultures and things like that. So I was just wondering if you believe that resilience means not just making it through, but kind of getting stronger in that process, and also if that year in space kind of helped you become maybe a tougher or stronger person overall.
Well, I think, yeah, I would agree with everything you said. I think part of being resilient is also, being able to accept failure, not accept it, but deal with it and recover from it. Um, my time in space definitely made my ability to deal with like this quarantine a lot easier because I know what it's like to live in isolation for a really long time, where in a situation where you don't have much control over what's going on. So, yeah, I think resiliency is about not giving up and not accepting failure and understanding, sometimes we all fail, we all make mistakes, and we can recover from them. I think my history of just being a real horrible student and then figuring out how to get past that and, go on to become a military officer, a pilot, a test pilot, an astronaut, is a pretty strong statement of being resilient. One great thing about this country we all live in is that we are absolutely a place that believes in second chances. And I think we are lucky that that's the case. And that's part of being resilient, is understanding that you can always change your narrative and change your direction and change your life.
So just being respectful of your time, we have some more questions, but it's 2:55. So I thought if you wanted to give some.
Yeah, why don't we
closing
go
thoughts.
get one more question and then I'll a little conclusion.
Yep. So another question we have is, what was it like to land the space shuttle?
Landing a space shuttle is challenging. It's not the hardest piloting task. I think the hardest piloting task is landing the F-14 Tomcat on the aircraft carrier at night. I would say about half the time it was terrifying. The other half, it was just scary at night. Daytime, it was sometimes fun, get used to it. Nighttime, not so much. What makes the space shuttle hard to land, though, is that you don't feel well. You've been in space. Now you're in gravity and you're dizzy. Your vision is affected. You might be nauseous. You're tired. You're in this big bulky suit, hard to move around in, hard to fly. The space shuttle itself has a time delay in the flight control system that would be absolutely unacceptable for an airplane, meaning that when you move the stick, nothing happens for 180 milliseconds, and then the nose will go up. And so it makes it very susceptible. It's called pilot-induced oscillation, where you can get kind of out of phase with it. Also, the stick itself, the control stick, unlike a normal airplane, it rotates in pitch at the base of your hand, but for roll, it rotates about a point that's like below your hand. So it's not a very harmonious control system that is easy to control. Has no engines. It has engines, but it has no fuel. So it's a big, 200,000-pound glider. And then the other thing that makes it challenging is, everyone's watching you, and you might only have one chance to do it. And your friends are going to harass you. Your colleagues are just going to give you an incredibly hard time if you mess it up. And I mean, I don't mean like crash mess it up. That's kind of a different category. But just, being a foot off the threshold crossing height, or landing a little fast or slow or left or right. That's what makes it hard. If you were to jump in a space shuttle right now, or if I was to jump in the space shuttle right now, I could probably land it better than when I was training to land it, only because I wasn't in space for 2 weeks beforehand. So thanks for your questions, guys. Let me just leave you with one last thought. And as you, venture out on your futures, despite what's going on, you should still be incredibly excited. This is the world we have. We have to deal with it. We have to be resilient, like Luke. Interesting name there, Luke, for space. I don't think we've had a Luke astronaut yet, but maybe someday. But, when I was leaving the space station for the last time, and I'm looking out the window at the part I could see, and I'm thinking to myself, this is a 1 million-pound space station. that we built. While flying around the Earth at 17,500 miles an hour in a vacuum and extremes of temperatures of plus minus 270 degrees, built by an international partnership, 15 different countries, different languages, different cultures, different technical ways of doing things. But this space station is the hardest thing we've ever done, I think, harder than going to the moon. We can do this. You know, we can do anything. If we want to go to Mars, we can go to Mars. If we want to cure cancer, we put the resources behind it, we can do that. Fix our challenges with the environment, which is incredibly important. You know, deal with this pandemic, the social unrest in this country. You know, after spending a year in space, I was absolutely inspired that if we can dream it, we can do it. You know, if we have a goal and a plan, if we're willing to take risks, make mistakes at times, being willing to fail, if we focus on what we can control and ignore what we can't. And of course, if we work together as a team, because teamwork, so important, makes the dream work. We can choose to do the hard things. And if you guys do that in your future, the sky, definitely not the limit. Thank you very much. Congrats on your graduation. Congrats on your lives ahead. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for
Thank
speaking.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.